The shooter on the rooftop didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon and fired 3 rounds into the lead vehicle before the convoy had even stopped rolling. Not a warning, not a mistake. A signal, coordinated, deliberate, practiced. This ambush had been waiting for days. If you've never heard the name Corporal Maya Carter, you're about to. Drop your city in the comments below. Let me see how far this story travels. And if you believe some soldiers are born, not made, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end. Part 1. The village that was too quiet. The convoy had been moving for 11 hours when the order came down to halt. Major General William Harlan stood beside the lead vehicle with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, studying the village ahead with the kind of attention that takes decades to develop. He had been in enough places that felt wrong to know the difference between wrong and dangerous. This place was both. "How long are we stopping?" Captain Leon Reeves asked, stepping up beside him with a map folded against his forearm. 3 hours, Harlan said. "Maybe less if I don't like what I see." "And what do you see, sir?" Harlan didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the cluster of low buildings ahead, the narrow passage between them that the road cut through like a scar. The village had a name on the map. He couldn't remember it, and he didn't care. What he cared about was the absence of something he couldn't immediately name. "Too quiet," he finally said. Reeves glanced around. "It's midday. Heat like this, people stay inside." "People stay inside. Dogs don't. Where are the dogs?" Reeves didn't have an answer for that. Harlan turned and walked back along the convoy, hands clasped behind his back, eyes moving over everything. 12 vehicles, 43 personnel, a mixed unit logistics communications infantry escort. Not a combat-ready assault force. A convoy. The kind of unit that moves supplies and doesn't expect to fight. The kind of unit that dies quietly in a kill zone. He pushed the thought aside. He was being careful. Careful was different from paranoid. He told himself that. Sergeant Daniel Briggs met him near the 4th vehicle, already reading the general's expression before a word was spoken. Briggs had been with Harlan long enough to understand that when the general walked like that, measured, slow, not stopping, something was building behind his eyes. "Sir." "Briggs, perimeter security, now, full spread." "Shama. Already on it, sir. Morrison's taken the right flank, I've got left. Make sure nobody gets comfortable. No one sits down, no one lights a cigarette, no one takes their eyes off those rooftops." Briggs nodded once and moved without a word. Harlan continued down the line. He passed vehicle after vehicle, nodding at soldiers who straightened when they saw him registering faces out of habit. Near the rear of the convoy, he slowed. A young woman was sitting on an ammunition crate with her back against the transport vehicle, her head down, a notebook open across her knee. She was writing something quickly, like she was capturing something before it disappeared. Beside her, leaning against the vehicle's wheel well, was an M24 sniper rifle in a soft case partially unzipped, the barrel visible. Harlan stopped. He looked at the rifle. Then he looked at her. She hadn't noticed him yet. Her pen moved fast across the page. Her posture was relaxed but not lazy, the kind of stillness that comes not from ease but from discipline. She sat like someone who had learned to conserve everything, movement included. "Soldier?" Her head came up fast. She was on her feet in an instant, notebook snapped shut, chin-level eyes straight ahead. "Sir, Corporal Maya Carter, sir." He looked her over. Young mid-20s at most. Her uniform was clean but worn at the knees. Her hands were steady. Her eyes moved to his face and held without flinching, and he noticed that. Not defiance, just composure. "Where are you assigned, Corporal?" "Rear support, sir. Communications backup and supply inventory." "Rear support," he repeated. "Yes, sir." He looked at the M24 again. "That rifle." A brief pause, just barely long enough to be noticeable. "Issued to me at staging, sir. Temporary issuance. Armorer said it needed to stay with the convoy manifest until reallocation at the forward base." "You qualified on that system?" Another pause, shorter this time. "I've handled it, sir." Harlan studied her face. He was good at reading faces. He had been doing it since before she was born. What he saw was not arrogance. What he saw was not deception. What he saw was something more unsettling. Someone who was being precise with her words because the precise words happened to be true while carrying something much larger behind them. "You've handled it," he said. "Yes, sir." He let the silence stretch for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked on. She sat back down before he was 20 feet away. She didn't open the notebook again. She looked at the village. He noted that too. Staff Sergeant Kyle Morrison was crouched near the right flank of the convoy when Harlan reached him, binoculars up, scanning a line of low structures on the village's eastern edge. Morrison. Sir, east side has two elevated positions. Both covered tarps, maybe hay bales. Could be storage. Could be. Could be more than that. Agreed. Harlan squinted. You see any movement in there at all? Nothing. Not since we stopped. Morrison lowered the binoculars and turned to face him. General, I've been in markets, villages, outposts across 3 countries, and I've never once pulled up to a place at midday and not had at least one kid come running toward the vehicles. Not one. These people know we're here. They're just not coming out. Because they were told not to. Morrison said nothing. The same conclusion arrived at the same moment. Keep your eyes on those elevated positions, Harlan said. If anything moves, anything at all, I want to know before it settles. Understood, sir. Harlan moved back toward the front of the convoy. He reached Captain Reeves and stopped beside him, looking at the village again. I want to push through, Harlan said. Reeves turned. Sir, we're scheduled for 3 hours. The rear elements need resupply coordination. If we roll now, if we stay, we're sitting in a box with the lid open. Harlan looked at the alley running between the 2 tallest structures, a gap barely wide enough for one vehicle. That was the passage. That was the only way through. How long to get the convoy moving? 10 minutes minimum. Some of the rear vehicles are already in partial maintenance. And that was when their first shot came. Not from the alley, not from the rooftops directly ahead. From the left. High and close, a single crack of sound that split the air like something tearing. And before the echo finished, 2 more followed from different directions. And Harlan understood in that half-second of clarity that the sound pattern was not panic, it was sequence. Rehearsed. The opening notes of something that had been scored long before they arrived. Contact left. Briggs's voice sharp and immediate. Then the village exploded. Harlan had been in firefights. He had been in ambushes. He had been in engagements so catastrophic that the debrief lasted longer than the battle. None of that knowledge made the sound less primal. The layered percussion of automatic fire from multiple elevations, the thud of rounds hitting vehicle steel, the immediate screaming of men who had been upright 1 second and were not the next. He threw himself behind the engine block of the lead vehicle as rounds sparked off the hood, and he was already thinking, already processing, because that was what he did, what he had always done, the part of him that stayed cold while everything around him burned. Left flank, right flank, rooftops, at least 3 separate firing positions, possibly more. Coordinated, simultaneous initiation. This wasn't a reactive ambush, someone spotting an opportunity and opening fire. This was planned at the trigger level. Someone had drawn out the timing, designated the sectors, given the signal. This was an operation against a convoy that was supposed to be a routine logistics movement. The question of how they knew would come later. Right now, the only question that mattered was whether any of his 43 people were going to survive the next 10 minutes. Reeves, he shouted over the noise. Here, sir. The captain had taken cover behind the second vehicle's passenger door, rifle up, but with no clear target. The firing was coming from positions that were covered, elevated, and distributed. Get communications on now. Get our position and contact report out before we lose the radio. Trying, sir, there's interference. Something's jamming. Then get someone to the rear vehicle and use the secondary system. Go. Reeves went. Harlan looked to his left and saw Briggs moving along the ditch line, low and fast, trying to establish a counter position against the left flank fire. He saw Morrison on the right doing the same. Both men were good. Both men were doing exactly what they should. It wasn't going to be enough. The kill zone was too well designed. The convoy was strung out along a road with no cover on either side, except the vehicles themselves, and the vehicles were being used against them. The enemy had clearly calculated the sight lines, calculated where the soldiers would shelter, and positioned their shooters accordingly. Every time someone moved to return fire from one side of a vehicle, they exposed themselves on the other. Harlan watched a private named Ortega sprint from the third vehicle toward a low wall, make it halfway, and go down hard. He watched Lieutenant Daniel Kessler run toward Ortega without hesitation, dragging him by the collar toward the wheel well of the second vehicle and take a round through the left shoulder in the process. Kessler didn't stop moving. He got Ortega to cover, pressed his back against the vehicle, and looked at the wound in his own arm with an expression that was almost offended before someone pulled him down. Harlan processed all of it in seconds. 12 vehicles, 43 personnel, at least 6 firing positions confirmed, communications compromised, 3 confirmed casualties in the first 90 seconds. And the attack was accelerating, not losing energy. Whoever was running this ambush was professional. They were maintaining rate of fire, which meant they had planned for ammunition. They weren't spraying, they were sustaining. The shooters on the rooftops were patient. They were waiting for soldiers to break cover out of desperation, and they were rewarded every time someone did. Harlan moved to the back of the lead vehicle and looked down the length of the convoy. He saw smoke. He saw soldiers pinned behind doors and wheel wells. He saw a gunner on the 4th vehicle trying to get his mounted weapon turned toward a rooftop position and taking fire every time he exposed himself. He saw Morrison bleeding from somewhere on his right arm, but still in position, still directing. And then he saw something that stopped him. Near the rear of the convoy behind the last transport vehicle, a figure was moving, not running, not taking cover, moving with deliberate controlled purpose, low measured using the vehicle's shadow. A rifle, the M24, was in her hands, and she was already seating the arm stock against her shoulder, already settling into a position against the vehicle's rear corner, and her body language was utterly unlike anything around her. Everyone else in the convoy was reacting. Briggs was reacting. Morrison was reacting. Reeves was reacting. Maya Carter was not reacting. She was choosing. Who gave her that rifle? Harlan shouted the words out of his mouth before he had consciously decided to say them, driven by the sheer absurdity of what he was seeing. A rear support corporal with a temporary issue sniper rifle. A woman who had been writing in a notebook 20 minutes ago, now positioned against the corner of a transport vehicle like she had done it 1,000 times. No one answered him, because no one around him knew. And the ones who might have had another answer, the answer that lived in the silence between her precise words back in their earlier conversation, were not in a position to explain it. The M24 cracked once. Hard, clean, authoritative, a sound completely different from the staccato chatter of the assault rifles around it. A single note in a very different register. On the rooftop to the northeast, a figure that had been firing steadily for the past 2 minutes dropped and did not rise. The soldiers nearest to that firing position reacted immediately. The incoming fire from that direction stopped, and the sudden gap in coverage let 2 pinned soldiers shift position, find better cover, get their weapons oriented. What? Reeves started. The M24 spoke again. A second rooftop position went silent. Not suppressed, eliminated. 1 round, 1 result. Harlan stood absolutely still behind the lead vehicle and watched. Maya's process was visible, even from a distance, even through the chaos. She wasn't hunting blindly. She was reading something, angles perhaps, or the pattern of where fire was originating and which positions had line of sight to which vehicles. She was sequencing. The way a person sequences when they have thought about a problem long enough to see not just the current state, but the next 2 states after it. She shifted her position, moved 3 steps to the left along the vehicle's rear, resettled and waited exactly 4 seconds. On the 4th second, a shooter in a second-floor window leaned forward to reacquire a target. The M24 fired. The window went quiet. Briggs had stopped moving. He was crouched in the ditch, looking back toward the rear of the convoy, and even from that distance, Harlan could see the expression on his face, the moment when a person's understanding of a situation completely reorganizes itself. "Briggs," Harlan called. "Sir." "Left flank, there's still a position in the alley eastern entrance. Get Morrison on it." "Copy that, sir." But Briggs's eyes went back to Maya for just a half second before he moved. The firefight had been running for 8 minutes. In those 8 minutes, the convoy had taken casualties, lost communication, and been completely pinned by a coordinated attack designed to hold them in place and reduce their numbers methodically. It had been working. In the 90 seconds since Maya Carter raised the M24 3 firing positions had gone silent. The rhythm of the attack, the sustained rotating fire that had been so methodically applied, had developed a gap. And in combat, a gap in rhythm is everything. It changes what the people on the other end of the guns believe is possible. The soldiers nearest the eliminated positions felt it first. The immediate pressure on them dropped and they moved, shifted, repositioned, got eyes on angles they hadn't been able to look at before. One of them, Private First Class Hendricks, got to a vehicle hood with a sight line on the alley position, and opened fire, not connecting but forcing a head down. The attack was still alive. They were still in the kill zone. There were still shooters on rooftops and in alleyways and behind whatever cover the village's geography offered. But something had changed. The attack had lost certainty. The ambush had been designed around a specific expectation that the convoy would have no precision response capability, that the elevated positions would be effectively untouchable from the road. That expectation was now wrong, and the people executing the attack could feel that it was wrong, and the feeling was spreading. Harlan watched Maya shift position again, this time moving further along the vehicle, using its full length as cover before settling at the front corner. From there, she had a different angle northwest toward the cluster of structures at the village's entry point, where at least 2 more shooters had been working. She was still calm. That was the thing that kept reaching him, kept pulling at his attention, even as he processed 100 other inputs simultaneously. In the middle of the most intense firefight the convoy had encountered, she was the calmest person on the battlefield. Not detached, her jaw was tight, her eyes were hard, the focus on her face was total and absolute. But calm, the kind of calm that isn't the absence of understanding what's happening. The kind of calm that comes from understanding it completely and having already made peace with what it requires. He had seen that calm before. He had seen it in a handful of people across his entire career. People who found in combat not a degradation of function, but a clarification of it. People for whom the noise and case and the presence of death operating at close range somehow removed the static and left only signal. He had never expected to see it in a rear support corporal who was supposed to be managing supply inventory. The M24 fired twice in quick succession, a controlled pair. Not panic, not instinct, but a deliberate double tap on a target that had shown itself briefly and then tried to withdraw. The first round connected. The second was insurance. The northwest corner went silent. Morrison's voice carried across the noise from the right flank. "They're pulling back. Right side, they're pulling back." "Hold your positions," Harlan called back. "Don't pursue. Hold your positions." He had seen retreats used as bait before. He wasn't going to let anyone chase a withdrawal into a secondary kill zone. But Morrison was right. The right flank fire was diminishing. Not because Morrison's team had neutralized it, because the loss of the elevated positions was making the coordinated attack impossible to sustain. When you plan an ambush around 6 or 8 interlocking fires and 3 of those fires disappear in 90 seconds, the geometry of the attack collapses. The remaining shooters can't cover all the angles alone. They're exposed. They know it. And now they were deciding that surviving this was more important than finishing it. Harlan looked down the convoy again. Smoke. Dust. The sound of fire was dropping, not gone, but dropping. The sustained roar of the ambush's peak was giving way to sporadic shots covering fire from people who were moving rather than holding. 11 minutes since first contact. He looked at the casualties. At least 4 down. He couldn't tell from this position who was seriously hurt and who was hit but functional. Kessler he had seen go down and get up. Ortega he wasn't sure about. There were others. He looked at Maya. She had moved again. She was back near the center of the rear transport vehicle, and she was still rifle down, resting against the vehicle, her breathing measured and deliberate. She was not hunting. She was waiting, reading the battle, deciding whether there was anything left worth engaging or whether the moment for that had passed. Briggs appeared at Harlan's shoulder. "Sir, 4 confirmed KYA on our side. Kessler's hit but stable shoulder wound. He's still operational." Morrison took a graze on his right arm. "Reeves has communications back up on the secondary system. QRF is 22 minutes out." Harlan nodded slowly. "The attack. Falling apart, sir. The rooftop positions are cleared. Alley position went quiet 6 minutes ago. Morrison's team thinks they withdrew. We've got 2 possible snipers still active on the northern edge, but they haven't fired in 4 minutes. They're deciding." "Yes, sir." Harlan turned and looked back at Maya again. She was watching the northern edge. Just watching. Patient. Like someone who had learned a very long time ago that waiting was its own form of action. "Sir," Briggs said carefully, "permission to speak." "Speak." A pause. She stopped them. Harlan didn't answer immediately. He let the words sit in the air between them and looked at what remained of the village ahead, smoke rising from 2 of the structures, the road through the passage still blocked by one of the convoy vehicles that had been pushed sideways when its driver was hit. He thought about the conversation he'd had with her 30 minutes ago. The precise words. The careful, accurate, true, but not complete answers. He thought about the notebook and the way she had been watching the rooftops before any of this started. He thought about the question he had shouted when he saw her raise the rifle. Who gave her that rifle? Nobody had given it to her. The armor had assigned it to a manifest. Fate had positioned her here, and something that had nothing to do with official authorization had guided her to pick it up at exactly the right moment and do with it something that no one else in this convoy had been able to do. He thought about what he was going to have to write in his report about this day. He thought about the 4 soldiers who were not going home because the ambush had worked for its first 11 minutes before she stopped it. He thought about how many more there would have been. She stopped them, he said, confirming what Briggs had said, not as a question. Yes, sir. Harlan looked at the road ahead, at the passage through the village, at the smoke, at the stillness that was settling back over everything, like the area was trying to remember what peace felt like. Get the casualties stabilized, he said. Get QRF updated on our position. Get this convoy ready to move the moment we have a cleared route. Yes, sir. Briggs started to move. Briggs. Sir, nobody touches that rifle. A pause. Sir, Harlan looked at him steadily. The M24 beside Corporal Carter. Nobody touches it. Nobody logs it as a discrepancy. Nobody processes a report about unauthorized weapons handling. Not today. Briggs studied his face for a moment. Then he nodded once, the kind of nod that meant understood completely every layer of it. Understood, sir. He moved away. Harlan stood alone beside the lead vehicle and looked back down the line to where Maya Carter still held her position, still watching the northern edge, still patient, still impossibly still, in a place where everything else had been noise and chaos and blood. He had been asking the wrong question. Who gave her that rifle? As if the rifle were the thing that needed explaining. The QRF arrived in 22 minutes exactly as Briggs had calculated, and the soldiers who came off those vehicles took one look at the convoy and stopped moving for just a second, that involuntary pause that happens when trained people arrive at a scene and the scene is worse than the radio transmission prepared them for. 4 covered bodies lined along the road beside the 3rd vehicle. Kessler sitting against a wheel with a field dressing on his shoulder and his rifle still across his knees. Morrison with his right arm wrapped and his jaw set like he was daring the wound to mean something. And the convoy itself scored with impact marks, one vehicle sitting sideways in the road at an angle that told the whole story of the moment its driver was hit. The QRF commander, Captain Darnell Webb, reached Harlan in 90 seconds and extended his hand without ceremony. Sir, you have any idea what hit you? Pre-plan, Harlan said. Multi-directional, at least 6 firing positions. They knew the route, knew the timing, knew which vehicles carried what. This wasn't opportunistic. He paused. Someone talked. Webb absorbed that without changing his expression, which told Harlan that Webb had already suspected the same thing from the radio reports. Casualties. 4 killed. Kessler and Morrison wounded, both functional. 2 others with minor injuries. And the enemy? Harlan was quiet for a moment. I'll give you a full brief. There are things in this engagement that are going to require a direct conversation. Webb looked at him with the particular attention of a man who has learned that when generals say things like that, what follows is never small. Understood, sir. Harlan turned and walked back toward the rear of the convoy without another word, and Webb fell into step behind him without being invited because instinct told him to. They found Maya Carter exactly where she had been. She had not moved from her position at the rear transport vehicle. She was seated on the ground now, her back against the vehicle's rear tire, the M24 resting across her thighs, and she was looking at nothing in particular, or rather she was looking at the middle distance, the way people look when they are processing something that doesn't have a clean narrative yet. She came to her feet when she saw the general. Sir. Harlan stopped in front of her. Webb stopped beside him and looked at the rifle, then at her, then at Harlan, and said nothing. Stand easy, Harlan said. She relaxed fractionally. Her hand stayed on the rifle. How many rounds did you fire? He asked. She didn't have to think about it. 9, sir. Webb made a sound that was not quite a word. 9 rounds, Harlan repeated. Yes, sir. And the results, well, she met his eyes. 7 confirmed. I'm not confident on the 8th. The 9th was a covering shot. I don't believe it connected. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. 7 confirmed kills with 9 rounds fired under active incoming fire from an improvised position with a rifle that had been issued to a convoy manifest rather than to a trained shooter. He had debriefed enough engagements to understand the math of what she had just told him, and the math was not within the range of outcomes that rear support corporals produced. "Where did you train?" he asked. The pause this time was longer than the ones before. She was weighing something. He could see it, not evasion, not guilt, but the specific weight of someone deciding how much of a truth to carry into the open. "I didn't train on the M24 through any formal program, sir." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "My father," she said, "from the time I was 9 years old, every weekend for 11 years. He was particular about it." "Your father." He believed that knowing how to shoot well was the difference between surviving certain situations and not surviving them. She looked at the rifle for a moment, then back at him. He was right. Webb exhaled slowly through his nose. Harlan heard it and understood it because he felt the same thing, the sensation of a story rearranging itself around a detail that had been present all along, but invisible. "Why didn't you disclose this during enlistment?" Harlan asked. "I disclosed my marksmanship scores. They were logged and filed. Nobody asked follow-up questions, sir. And the assignment to rear support," her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I requested a combat role. I was reassigned to rear support during the unit rebalancing 3 months ago. The documentation cited force structure requirements." Harlan said nothing. She said nothing. Between them, the unspoken truth sat very clearly that she had been moved to the back of the formation, not because of her capability, but because of assumptions that had nothing to do with capability, and that those assumptions had nearly gotten every person in this convoy killed, and that the only reason they hadn't was because of what she had done with a rifle that wasn't technically hers to fire. Webb cleared the throat. "Sir, I need to get my people organized for route clearance." "If you need, go ahead," Harlan said without looking at him. Webb moved away. Harlan stayed where he was. "Corporal Carter." "Sir, you're going to give Sergeant Briggs a full account of your engagement, every shot, every target, every decision. You're going to be specific and accurate." "Yes, sir." "And then you're going to get some water, check your hands." He glanced at her hands, steady on the rifle, completely steady. "And you're going to stay with this convoy until we reach the forward base." "Yes, sir." He turned to go. Then he stopped. "Carter." "Sir." "Your father, is he still living?" She looked at him, and something passed through her eyes that was complicated grief maybe, or gratitude, or the particular ache of being understood by the wrong person at the wrong time. "No, sir, he passed 2 years ago." Harlan nodded once. It was a small nod, but it carried weight, and she felt it. Then he walked back up the convoy toward the business of putting together what had been broken, and she watched him go. And only when he was past the third vehicle did she sit back down and let out a breath she had been holding since approximately the first shot. It took 11 minutes for Sergeant Briggs to make his way to her. He came around the rear of the transport vehicle and crouched down beside her without preamble, a small notebook already open in his hand. "Full account," he said. "General's orders. Tell me everything." She told him. She started with the moment she picked up the rifle, which was before the first shot, when the silence had reached a particular quality that she recognized without being able to fully articulate why, and she moved through every engagement, every position, every calculation. She told him about the sequence she had identified in the rooftop fire, the pattern of alternating sectors that told her which positions were covering, which, and therefore which positions, if eliminated in which order, would create the fastest cascade of exposure for the remaining shooters. Briggs wrote it all down. He asked 3 clarifying questions. He did not ask the one that was most obviously sitting in his mind, and she appreciated that. When she finished, he closed the notebook and looked at her with the flat, evaluating expression of a man who has processed a great deal of unexpected information and arrived at a conclusion he hadn't predicted. "You planned the sequence before you picked up the rifle," he said. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "Yes, before the shooting started. I had a working hypothesis. I revised it in the first 45 seconds. Briggs was quiet for a moment. "Most trained snipers can't do that in a cold contact scenario. They're working off doctrine, working off what they were taught. You were building a model." "I was watching," she said simply. "You were watching before we stopped. I saw you looking at the village. Yes, and you knew. I knew something was wrong. I didn't know specifically what. I was building contingencies. He nodded slowly, then he said very quietly, "You should have said something." She looked at him. "I did, Sergeant, when we stopped. I told Private Delgado that the rooftop on the northeast corner had an exposure window at a specific angle, and that whoever was up there had probably been in position for at least 4 hours based on the dust pattern on the ledge. Delgado told me I was reading too much into it and to stay with the rear vehicles." Briggs stared at her. "Delgado, yes." He closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then he opened them. "I'm going to need you to include that in the formal account." "I know. It's going to be uncomfortable. Sergeant, 4 people died today in an ambush that I believe I could have helped prevent if someone had listened to me 20 minutes earlier. Uncomfortable doesn't begin to..." She stopped herself, took a breath, reset. "Yes, I'll include it in the formal account." Briggs stood. He looked down at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. It was somewhere between respect and something that looked almost like remorse. "Carter," he said. "Sergeant, for what it's worth." He paused. "Good shooting." He walked away before she could respond. She sat with that for a long time. 40 minutes after the QRF arrived, the convoy was reorganized and the route ahead had been declared passable. The 4 bodies had been carefully loaded. Kessler had refused evacuation and was in the second vehicle with his arm immobilized, and his expression making clear that anyone who suggested he leave the convoy would be doing so at personal risk. Morrison was similarly immovable, stationed at the right flank of the reformed convoy, with his rifle slung across his unwounded arm and his jaw still set at that same angle. Harlan stood at the front of the reformed column and looked back along its length. He was doing math that no general wants to do, the math of what had happened against the math of what had almost happened. 43 personnel, 12 vehicles, 1 compromised route, 1 pre-planned surgical ambush. The numbers of what had actually occurred: 4 killed, 3 wounded, 1 vehicle disabled, communications disrupted for 8 critical minutes. The numbers of what had been trajectory, what the attack had been designed to produce, what it would have produced if its geometry had held for another 10 or 15 minutes. He didn't want to complete that calculation. But he was a general, and generals do not have the luxury of not completing calculations. He thought about Private Delgado. He had spoken to Delgado already, a brief specific conversation that had left Delgado's face a color it had never been before, and would probably never be again. The young man hadn't been malicious. He had been dismissive in the way that people are dismissive of information that doesn't fit their current model of the world. Maya had offered him a data point that required him to take a corporal from rear support seriously, to treat her observation as operationally relevant, to change what he was doing based on what she had said. He hadn't, because she was rear support, because she was new to the unit, because the information came packaged in a form that his training and experience, and probably several other things he would spend the rest of his life examining, hadn't prepared him to receive. 4 soldiers were dead. The convoy was alive. Both of those facts were true simultaneously, and the space between them was where everything that had happened today lived. Webb appeared at his shoulder. "Route's clear, sir. We can move in 5. Any sign of the remaining shooters?" 2 confirmed fled north. "We tracked them to the edge of the village boundary and lost the trail. They're gone." And the village itself, cleared. Roughly 60 civilian residents, all accounted for, all in the eastern structures. They were told to stay inside. Some of them have been in there since last night. Webb paused. "There's something else." Harlan looked at him. "One of the village elders. He speaks enough English to communicate. He says a man came through yesterday evening, 1 man outsider, not from this area. Said he paid 3 families to leave their rooftops clear and their shutters closed. Told them there would be noise and not to come out until it was finished. 1 man organized this. 1 man coordinated it. The shooters were brought in different routes, arrived after dark. The elder says he didn't know what was planned until he heard the first shots this morning." Harlan processed that. 1 man, 1 organizer, someone who knew the convoy's route, its schedule, its composition well enough to position shooters appropriately. Someone who understood military convoy movements at a level that required either training or access to information. The intelligence leak question just got significantly more specific. "Get that elder's account documented," Harlan said. Full description of the man if he can provide it. I want it transmitted to intelligence before we clear this position. Already in progress, sir. Harlan nodded. 5 minutes, then we move. Webb moved away. Harlan turned and looked back down the convoy one more time. This time not doing math, but just looking at the soldiers preparing to move, checking weapons and equipment, and each other the way soldiers do after something like this, the physical reassurance of proximity and continuity. His eyes found Maya Carter at the rear of the column. She was in position, not seated now. Standing at the rear corner of the last transport vehicle, the M24 in her hands, watching the road behind them with complete attention. She had assumed without being asked, without being ordered, the role of rear security for a convoy that was about to be moving through territory that had just tried to kill them all. Briggs was watching her too from his position near the center of the column. He caught Harlan's eye across the distance and held it for a moment. And in that look was everything that neither of them was going to say right now in this place, with so much else requiring immediate attention. The convoy began to move. The first 10 minutes were the hardest. Every soldier in the column had their threat response spiked to the point where shadows felt dangerous, where the slightest sound from the road's edge made hands tighten on weapons. It was the aftermath state, the period after contact, where the body hasn't accepted that the immediate danger has passed and keeps sending the same signals: threat, threat, prepare, react. Maya didn't have that problem, which was itself a problem of a different kind. She sat in the rear of the last vehicle with the M24 across her knees and watched the road behind them with the same quality of attention she had brought to everything today, not hyper-vigilant, not spinning, but focused, reading. The landscape moving away behind them, the dust settling in the convoy's wake, the geometry of sightlines as the village shrank in distance. Private First Class Hendricks was in the vehicle with her. He was 19 years old, had been in the service for 14 months, and had spent the last hour trying to figure out whether what he had witnessed during the firefight was real or some artifact of the adrenaline and fear that had been running through him. He kept looking at her and then looking away, and finally, 20 minutes into the movement, he said what he had been trying not to say since the shooting stopped. "Were you scared?" She looked at him. He was young, genuinely young in the way that makes the word mean something beyond chronological age. The kind of young that hasn't yet built the calluses that experience applies to the places in a person that feel things most sharply. "Yes," she said. He blinked. He had not expected that answer. "You didn't look scared." Looking scared and being scared are different things. She paused, then said something that wasn't planned, something that came from a more unguarded place. "My hands started shaking after the fourth shot. I had to wait through it." He stared at her. "After the fourth shot. Not before. Before, I was moving too fast to feel it. After the fourth shot, I had a 7-second window where there was no clean target and my hands caught up with the rest of me." She looked out the rear of the vehicle. 7 seconds is a long time when you're counting it. Hendricks was quiet for a while. Then, "How did you keep going?" Because stopping wasn't a choice. She said it simply, without drama, without the kind of weight that people put on such statements when they want them to sound significant. It sounded like a fact, which was what it was. There were still people out there that needed to not be out there anymore. The shaking didn't change that. He sat with that for the rest of the drive. An hour and 40 minutes after the convoy began moving, it reached the forward base. The entry through the gate had the particular quality of arrivals that come after something bad, slower than normal. Watched more carefully the gate personnel taking in the marked vehicles and the body count and the expression on every face and understanding without being told that today had been different. Harlan was out of his vehicle before it fully stopped. He had 3 things he needed to do immediately in order to get the wounded into medical, get his 4 dead properly received, and sit down with his intelligence officer before the details of what had been discussed in the village started to blur. He did all 3. 2 hours later, he was in the command tent with his intelligence officer, Major Sandra Pollack and Captain Webb, and he was laying out everything the village elder had told them against everything he already knew about the convoy's movements and schedule. The route was classified at the battalion level, Pollack said. She had a map on the table and she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at Harlan. 3-hour halt was added to the schedule 48 hours ago. That's when it went to the convoy briefing package. Who had access to the briefing package? 32 personnel at battalion level 17 at brigade. She paused. and whatever administrative access the logistics coordination required. Someone in that pool talked, or was watched, or had their communications accessed. She pushed a folder across the table. We've been tracking a pattern of compromised road intelligence for the past 6 weeks. 3 other convoys, different units, different areas of operation, but the same signature, pre-positioned, coordinated, initiated cleanly. Not random, not opportunistic. Harlan looked at the folder. Same organizer. We believe so. Then the man the village elder described fits a profile we've been building. Pollock leaned forward. Sir, if this is who we think it is, today's ambush wasn't designed to wipe out a random logistics convoy. It was designed to send a message about our route intelligence, to show us that they have access to information we believe is secure. The tent was very quiet. A demonstration, Harlan said. A demonstration, yes, sir. Webb, who had been silent for several minutes, said, 4 soldiers died to send a message. Nobody answered him because there was no answer that made that better. Harlan closed the folder. He sat with it for a moment, the weight of it, the operational implications, the investigation that was now going to have to run through his entire chain of logistics, communications, the trust that was going to have to be examined and potentially shattered at the battalion level. Then he stood up. I need to go see my wounded. He found Kessler first in the medical tent, with his shoulder packed and immobilized and his face carrying the particular look of someone who has been told to rest and is spending every second of rest thinking about everything he should be doing instead. General, Kessler started to sit up. Stay down, Lieutenant. He stayed down, but barely. Harlan pulled a camp chair close to the cot and sat. You're going to be fine. I know that, sir. The shoulder it's manageable. I've had worse from training accidents. He paused. Sir, can I ask the situation this morning after I went down? I've been getting fragments from the debrief reports, and I'm not sure I understand. You were doing what you were supposed to be doing, Harlan said. What happened after you went down, that's a longer conversation. Kessler looked at him. Corporal Carter, Hendricks told me, before medical got him to shut up. He was quiet for a moment. She was in my vehicle for 6 hours before the halt. I spoke to her twice, once about the supply manifest and once about where she was sitting. I didn't look at her, sir. Not really. Nobody did? That's not an excuse. No, Harlan agreed. It's not. Kessler looked at the ceiling of the medical tent. Is she all right? Harlan considered the question. What he had seen in Maya Carter, the particular stillness, the way she had been sitting in the rear of the last vehicle watching the road behind them, the thing Hendricks had unknowingly captured in that brief exchange about fear and shaking hands and choice, was not all right in the ordinary sense. It was something more demanding than all right. It was the state of a person who has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, who has done something necessary that has a permanent cost and who knows it and has decided to carry it because the alternative was not acceptable. She's exactly where she needs to be, he said. That night in the forward base, with the sounds of the camp settling into its nighttime rhythms around her, Maya Carter sat outside the rear supply tent where she had been assigned a cot, and she held the M24 across her knees, and she did not sleep. She was not spiraling. She was not breaking. She was doing the thing that honest people do after they have killed. She was looking at it directly, not turning away from it, not dressing it in language that made it easier to carry. 7 men. She had been certain of 7. She had calculated their positions, anticipated their movements, chosen the moments of maximum exposure, and she had not missed. She had been trained not to miss. She had spent 11 years on ranges and in fields with a father who had believed with a kind of quiet ferocity that accuracy was a form of respect for the target. She thought about that now. His voice, the way he would correct her grip without raising his voice, the patience of someone who understood that mastery is not a destination, but a practice. She wondered what he would have said today. She thought he would have said, you did what the situation required. She thought he would have also said, now you have to live with it, and that is not the same as recovering from it. She thought he was right, the way he was usually right, the way she would have given most things to be able to tell him. Briggs found her there at some time past midnight. He didn't say anything. He just came and sat on the ground nearby his back against the tent wall, and for a long time neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that isn't uncomfortable because it isn't empty. It's the silence of 2 people who have both understood something today and don't need to perform the understanding for each other. Finally, Briggs said quietly, "The general put a note in the operational file." She looked at him. "About the engagement, about your account, about what Delgado should have done differently." He paused. "About what's going to change." She was quiet. "I don't know exactly what he's going to do," Briggs said, "but I know he's a man who takes what happened today seriously. All of it, not just the ambush. The whole picture." She nodded. She looked back out into the dark. "Sergeant," she said. "Yeah, the four we lost today." She said it carefully, the way you say the things that matter most. "I've been going over the sequence. If I had picked up the rifle when I first noticed the rooftops before the halt, when I had the suspicion but not the certainty, I might have been able to." "Don't," Briggs said, not harshly, firmly. "You had a suspicion. You reported it. It was dismissed. You acted the moment acting became the only option. That's the whole story." "That's not the whole story. It's the part that belongs to you." He let that sit for a moment. "The rest of it belongs to other people, and they're going to have to carry it." She didn't answer, but something in her posture changed, an infinitesimal shift, the kind that happens when a weight that has been resting on a single point is redistributed across a broader surface, not gone, just differently carried. The base was quiet around them. Somewhere in the command tent, Harlan was still awake, working through paperwork that had no clean answers, building a record of the day that would outlast everyone involved in it. He was writing about the ambush and the casualties and the intelligence failure and the operational response. He was writing carefully and precisely the way a man writes when he knows that what he puts on paper today is going to matter tomorrow and next week and for longer than that. At a certain point, he stopped writing and looked at the section about Corporal Maya Carter. He read it twice. Then he picked up his pen and added a line that was not part of the standard after-action format, a line that exceeded what the form asked for, a line that he added anyway because the form did not have a category for what she had done or what she was. "She is not what this unit believed her to be," he wrote. "She never was. The error was ours, and the cost of that error has been paid. The only responsible response is to not repeat it." He set the pen down, looked at what he had written, picked the pen back up. "And she deserves to be somewhere the rifle she carries is never described as temporary." The formal inquiry convened at 0800 the following morning, inside a room that was designed for logistics briefings and had never been intended for anything, requiring the level of tension that walked in with the 7 people who sat down around its folding table. Major General Harlan sat at the head. To his left, Major Sandra Pollock with 2 folders in front of her and the expression of someone who has read documents that confirm things she had hoped would not be confirmed. Captain Webb to her left, Sergeant Briggs at the far end, which was not standard for an inquiry of this nature, but which Harlan had specified because Briggs had been on the ground and Harlan had long ago stopped caring about the appearance of protocol when the substance of truth was on the table. On the other side, Captain Reeves, Private Delgado, and Corporal Maya Carter. Delgado looked like a man standing on the edge of something he couldn't see the bottom of. He was 23 years old, and he had spent most of the night understanding in increasing and merciless detail what the dismissal of a single report had cost. His hands were flat on the table, and he was keeping them there by conscious effort. Maya was looking at the table directly in front of her, not down at the table. The difference mattered. Down is avoidance. Straight ahead at a fixed point is the posture of someone who has decided to be present for something difficult. Harlan looked at everyone in the room once. Then he opened without preamble. "This inquiry is not punitive in its primary purpose. It is investigative. We are here to establish a complete and accurate record of the events of yesterday, including the decisions made before, during, and after contact. That record will inform both the intelligence investigation currently underway and the operational adjustments that will follow." He paused. "Everyone in this room will be completely honest. That is not a request." He looked at Delgado. "Private Delgado, at approximately 14:20 hours before the convoy halted, Corporal Carter approached you with a specific observation about a rooftop position. Tell me in your own words exactly what she said and exactly what you said in response." Delgado's jaw moved once before the words came. "She said she told me the rooftop on the northeast corner had an exposure pattern consistent with a pre-positioned shooter. She used the phrase dust pattern on the ledge and said whoever was up there had probably been in position for several hours." He stopped. "I told her she was reading too much into it. And then And then I told her to stay with the rear vehicles. Did you report her observation to anyone? The pause was very small, but visible to everyone in the room. No, sir. Why not another pause longer, the kind where a person is deciding between the answer that sounds defensible and the answer that is true, and finding that the defensible answer has dissolved overnight under the weight of what happened? I didn't take it seriously, sir. Why not? Delgado looked at his hands. She was rear support. I didn't have a reason to think she would have better situational awareness than. He stopped himself, started again. I made an assumption, sir, about who the information was coming from. I didn't evaluate the information itself. Harlan let that sit in the room for exactly 10 seconds. Long enough for everyone to feel it. Not long enough for it to become about humiliation, because humiliation was not what this was for. Corporal Carter, he said, when Private Delgado dismissed your observation, what did you do next? Maya lifted her eyes from the table and looked directly at Harlan. I considered reporting it through another channel, sir. I decided against it because I had no physical evidence, only an observation based on pattern recognition, and I assessed that a second dismissal would have the same result as the first and would consume time that I couldn't afford to lose. So you returned to your position? Yes, sir, and I kept watching. And during that watching, what else did you observe? The alley on the eastern entry had been partially blocked by what appeared to be a cart with broken wheels. The position and angle of the blockage was inconsistent with accidental placement. It would have been easier to move it to either side of the road than to leave it centered. It was positioned to slow vehicle movement through the passage without appearing deliberately obstructive. She paused. I also observed that two of the buildings on the northern edge had their upper shutters closed on the side facing the road while the lower shutters were open. That's backwards from thermal logic. In that heat, you close the lower shutters to block ground level heat and open the upper ones for air movement, unless you need the upper floor dark for a reason. The room was very still. Webb was looking at her with the expression of a man involuntarily recalibrating something. Pollock had stopped moving entirely. Briggs was staring at the table with his jaw tight and his eyes doing the specific calculation of someone running a counterfactual. If this information had reached him before the halt, if someone had brought it up the chain, what would have changed? Reeves said quietly and without meaning to say it at all, "You saw all of that." Maya looked at him. "Yes, sir." "Before the shooting started?" "Yes, sir." "And you told Delgado?" "I told Private Delgado what I observed first, the rooftop. It was the most immediately actionable indicator. I was going to report the others when I had a moment to." She stopped, recalibrated. There was no moment. Harlan looked at Reeves. "Captain, Corporal Carter approached Private Delgado, who was under your direct supervision. When Private Delgado received a force protection observation from a member of the convoy and dismissed it without reporting it, the failure did not exist in a vacuum. It existed in a command environment where the standard for reporting was not adequately enforced." Reeves's face did not change. It didn't need to. He understood. "Yes, sir. That is also going in the record." "Understood, sir." Harlan looked back at Maya. "During the engagement, you fired 9 rounds from the M24. You confirmed 7 results. Your engagement sequence specifically targeted the elevated positions in an order designed to collapse the attack's interlocking fire structure." He paused. "Walk me through the sequence decision." She did. She walked through it with the same precision she had given Briggs the night before, but with more detail now in a context where the detail was formally required. She named the positions in the order that she had engaged them, explained the reasoning for each prioritization, described the way the attack's fire pattern had shifted after the second elimination, and how that shift had confirmed her model of the interlocking sectors. When she finished, Harlan said nothing for almost 15 seconds. Then Pollock spoke, and her voice had the quality of someone who has been sitting on a question and can no longer justify sitting on it. "Corporal Carter, the sequence you just described, the logic of collapsing an interlocking fire structure by targeting specific nodes in a specific order, that is a tactic, a doctrinal tactic. Where did you learn it?" Maya looked at her. "I read Major." "You read?" "Extensively. Military history, tactical doctrine, engagement theory. I've been reading it since I was 16. At 16, my father had a library." She said it flatly without apology or performance. He believed that understanding why something works is more important than being told that it does. Pollock sat back in her chair slightly, and the motion was involuntary, the physical reaction of a mind that has just fully absorbed something it had been holding at partial distance. Harlan looked at Briggs. Briggs was already looking back at him. In that look was the whole history of the previous evening, the conversation outside the supply tent, the things Briggs had said and the things Maya had said, and the specific weight of a night spent understanding a very large thing in a very honest way. Harlan looked back at the table. He made a decision. This inquiry is going to recess for 20 minutes, he said. Reeves Delgado, you're dismissed from this room. Wait outside. Pollock Webb, I need you to stay. Reeves and Delgado stood. Delgado looked at Maya before he went a brief look, uncomfortable and direct a look of someone who wants to say something and has not yet figured out what that something should be. Then they were gone. Harlan waited for the sound of the door to settle. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table, and looked at Maya with the kind of attention he usually reserved for intelligence briefings on matters of strategic consequence. I'm going to ask you something outside the formal record, he said, and you can answer it in whatever way you choose. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Why rear support? She looked at him. Not confused, she understood the question exactly. He wasn't asking about the administrative decision. He was asking about her, about why someone who had this capability, this knowledge, this evident and fully developed precision had ended up in the back of a convoy managing supply manifests. I tried for a different assignment, she said. 3 times. The first 2 times I was told that my profile didn't fit the operational requirements of the roles I applied for. The 3rd time a colonel told me directly that certain unit compositions needed to be maintained and that I should focus on where I could contribute most effectively. She paused. He said it kindly. Pollock made a sound that was quiet and sharp and involuntary. Certain unit compositions, Harlan repeated. Yes, sir. And when you were reassigned to rear support 3 months ago? Force structure requirements, she said. Those were the words in the documentation. Harlan looked at Pollock. Pollock looked back with an expression that said she had known this story existed somewhere in the personnel system and had not expected to be sitting across from it this particular morning. Webb said very carefully, how many times did you requalify on your marksmanship scores? Every cycle, sir. My scores were consistently in the top 3% of the battalion. Top 3%, Webb said. Yes, sir. And you were assigned to rear support. Yes, sir. The room held that fact for a long moment, and every person in it felt the specific weight of it differently. Harlan, and with the cold precision of a man who is adding things up and arriving at a number that makes him deeply and productively angry. Pollock, with the particular frustration of someone who works in intelligence and recognizes a systemic failure of information processing when she sees one Webb with something that was closest to plain shame. Briggs was looking at the far wall, and his expression was unreadable, which meant he was reading everything. The record will reflect, Harlan said, and his voice had taken on a particular quality, not louder, not harder, but more final. The way a door sounds when it closes, and you can tell from the sound alone that it is not going to open from the other side. That Corporal Carter's assignment to rear support is not supported by her demonstrated capabilities and represents a misallocation of a highly significant operational asset. He looked at Maya directly. It will also reflect that what you did yesterday, the decision to engage, the precision of the engagement, the tactical reasoning underlying the sequence was not luck and was not circumstance. It was the product of capability that this unit failed to identify, assess, or employ appropriately. She was looking at him steadily. Something moved through her face, not relief, not vindication, not anything that had a clean name. It was the specific expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time to be seen accurately and who finds, in the moment it finally happens, that it is both more and less than they expected. Sir, she said quietly, 4 people died yesterday. Yes. I need that to not get lost. It won't, he said, and the way he said it made it a promise rather than a reassurance. The inquiry reconvened 12 minutes later, not 20. Harlan had reconvened it early because he had made the decisions he needed to make and did not see the value of sitting with them longer. He brought Reeves and Delgado back in. He concluded the formal record. He assigned Pollock to coordinate with the intelligence investigation. He directed Reeves to submit a revised force protection protocol for convoy halts That included a mandatory channel for reporting force protection observations from any personnel, regardless of assigned role. Then he looked at Maya. Corporal Carter, effective immediately, you are reassigned from rear support to forward overwatch. The room went very still. Reeves looked up. Webb looked up. Delgado was staring at the table. Briggs did not move. Maya looked at Harlan with an expression that was absolutely composed and absolutely alert. No ceremony, Harlan said. No formal transfer package, not today. That comes later. Today it is an operational necessity, and I am treating it as such. He paused. The M24 is no longer a temporary issuance. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything that needed to be said, and what they said was not gratitude. Exactly, it was something more fundamental than gratitude. It was recognition. The specific recognition of a person who has spent years knowing something about themselves and being told repeatedly and by various systems and structures that what they knew was not relevant. It was the recognition of someone who has been correct all along and is finally in a room where that correctness is not in dispute. Dismissed, Harlan said. Everyone stood. The room began to move toward the door with the organized flow of people who have things to do and are ready to go do them. Carter, she stopped, turned. Harlan was still seated, a pen in his hand, the formal record open in front of him. He looked up at her with the expression of a man who has one more thing to say and has decided to say it because there are not many opportunities for the right thing to be said, and when one presents itself, a person should not pass it. You told Sergeant Briggs last night that you were second-guessing the timing of your decision to engage, whether you should have acted sooner. She was completely still. I've read every debrief I could access this morning, he said. I've talked to Briggs and to Hendricks and to Morrison. I've looked at the sequence of the engagement from every angle I can look at it. He paused. You acted at the earliest moment that your information justified action. Everything before that moment was observation, which was also exactly right. The failure that created the conditions for yesterday is not yours to carry. She swallowed once. Yes, sir. That's an order, Corporal. Something that might have been the beginning of something fragile passed across her face and was immediately controlled. Yes, sir. She turned and went. The day that followed was the hardest kind of busy, the kind where there is no space between tasks, where the practical and the necessary push against each other in a continuous stream that doesn't allow for the long thoughts, only the short ones. Harlan spent 3 hours with Pollock going through the intelligence file on the convoy network leak. He spent an hour with the battalion commander by secure line, giving an account that was precise and complete, and that generated at several points a silence on the other end that told him the battalion commander was understanding things he had not understood before. Morrison checked himself out of medical at 1000 and reported to Briggs at 10:30 with his arm in a sling and his expression making clear that the sling was temporary, and the sling knew it. Briggs looked at him for 10 seconds and then put him on light logistics coordination because there was no point arguing with Morrison, and there was also real work that needed doing. Kessler remained in medical at the insistence of the medical officer who had described Kessler's shoulder wound in terms that made the structural argument against him returning to any kind of duty self-evidently correct. Kessler spent the morning reading and not looking like he was thinking about Maya Carter, which meant he was thinking about Maya Carter. At 1300, Harlan found Briggs outside the command tent. How is she? He asked. Briggs didn't pretend not to know who he meant. Working, he said. I put her on a route assessment with Hale. They've been going through the next 3 convoy paths, looking at them from an overwatch perspective, where you'd position if you were planning an ambush, what the exposure windows look like from elevation. Hale's working with her. Hale asked to work with her. Briggs paused. He watched her during the engagement from the right flank. He came to me this morning before the inquiry and said, and I'm quoting directly here, that he had been shooting competitively for 6 years, and he could not do what she did under those conditions, and he would like to understand how she does it. Harlan absorbed that, and she's been explaining it to him for the past 2 hours, and Hale, who is not a humble man, has been listening without interrupting. Briggs looked at the general. She's a teacher, sir, on top of everything else. She explains things the way people explain things when they actually understand them, instead of just being able to do them. Harlan nodded slowly. Keep me informed. Sir, there's one more thing. Briggs reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. Found this in the inquiry room after everyone left. It fell out of Delgado's jacket. Harlan took it and unfolded it. It was a handwritten note, 3 lines written in the kind of careful block letters that people use when they're writing something they've rewritten several times. I heard you. I should have listened. I am sorry for what that cost. It was not signed. It didn't need to be. Harlan folded it back up and held it for a moment. Did she see it? No, sir. Make sure she does. Briggs took it back. Yes, sir. That evening at 1700, when the operational tempo had dropped enough for the forward base to breathe, Harlan sat down at his desk and opened the personnel file he had requested from the battalion records office that morning. Maya Carter's complete file, from enlistment to the present day. He read it in 40 minutes. When he finished, he sat for a long time without moving. The file documented in the bloodless language of military administration exactly what she had told him, and several things she hadn't because they weren't things she would have thought to mention in an inquiry room. 3 requests for reassignment to combat roles, each denied. Marksmanship scores logged and filed in the appropriate section, never elevated or flagged or routed to a commander who might have understood what they indicated. A performance review from 8 months ago that described her as diligent, reliable, and well-suited to support operations. Diligent, reliable, well-suited to support operations. Written by someone who had seen the scores and not seen the person. He thought about how close yesterday had come to a different outcome. Not just tactically, he had already processed the tactical math extensively. He thought about the personal math. A convoy that had reached its halt, made its 3-hour stop, taken its casualties, survived its ambush through the collective effort of trained soldiers doing trained soldier things, and arrived at the forward base without the specific thing that had actually made the difference. He thought about her sitting outside the supply tent at midnight with the M24 across her knees and the weight of 7 men and 4 colleagues behind her eyes. He thought about what she had said in the inquiry room. I need that to not get lost. She was not asking for a monument. She was not asking for a ceremony or a commendation or any of the apparatus that the military deploys around acts of courage. She was asking for the simplest and most demanding thing, that the cost of yesterday be understood as real and permanent, that the 4 names on those covered bodies not be processed as an operational data point and filed. He understood her. He had always been able to understand people when he looked at them honestly, and he had been looking at her honestly since the first moment he stood in front of her and asked about the rifle. He picked up a pen and opened the routing form for personnel reassignment. He did not hesitate. He wrote quickly in the decisive handwriting of a man who has already done all his thinking and is now just recording the conclusion. When he finished, he signed it, dated it, and set it in the outgoing stack. Then he sat back in his chair and thought about the next convoy. 3 days out, a different route, but the same territory, the same intelligence, uncertainty, the same fundamental question of whether the convoy that moved through it would be protected adequately or whether the gap between capability and deployment would cost someone something they could not get back. 3 days. He thought about Maya Carter at the front of the column instead of the back of it. He thought about what changes when the right person is in the right position and what it costs every time they are not. He turned off the desk light. Outside the tent, the forward base continued its nighttime operations generators, voices the distant percussion of a world that did not stop because 4 soldiers were no longer in it. He listened to all of it for a while, the way he always did at the end of a day that had demanded more than most. And then he went to find the medical officer because Kessler had been in that tent long enough and there were things Kessler needed to know. Kessler was sitting up when Harlan arrived at the medical tent, which was either progress or defiance, depending on how the medical officer chose to interpret it. The sling on his shoulder was new, properly fitted, the kind that actually immobilized the joint rather than suggesting it might like to stay still. His color was better than the evening before. His eyes were the same as they had always been, sharp, tracking the eyes of a man whose mind had not taken the hit that his body had. Sir, he moved to stand. Don't, Harlan said. He pulled a camp chair to the bedside and sat with the ease of a man who has spent enough time in military medical facilities to have stopped feeling any formality about them. How's the shoulder? Functional within parameters. Kessler's version of fine. The medical officer disagrees. The medical officer is being appropriately cautious. He paused. Sir, I heard about the reassignment. Harlan looked at him. From whom? Morrison. Morrison heard it from Hale. Hale was apparently working with her this afternoon, and information moves fast in a forward base. It always has, sir. Kessler was quiet for a moment. He turned his head slightly, looking at the tent wall in the particular way of a man organizing his thoughts before he commits them to language. I wanted to ask you something, off the record if that's possible. Ask. Do you think she knows what she's walking into? Harlan studied him. Explain what you mean. The reassignment, forward overwatch on the next convoy. Kessler turned back to face him. I've been in forward overwatch positions. I've coordinated with the snipers who work them. What she did in that village, the tactical precision, the sequence, all of it, that was real and it was extraordinary. I'm not disputing that. He paused. But there's a difference between doing something in a moment of acute necessity and being assigned to do it routinely as a role, with everything that comes with the role. The isolation of the position, the weight of decisions that are yours alone, the specific thing that happens to people who do that work for sustained periods. Harlan listened to all of it. Then he said, "What makes you think she doesn't know?" Kessler blinked. "Sir, you're describing the psychological cost of sustained precision engagement work as if it's information she hasn't encountered. She's been reading tactical doctrine and military history since she was 16. She's been training with a rifle for 11 years. She told Hendricks last night that her hands started shaking after the fourth shot and she waded through it." He paused. "She knows exactly what she's walking into, Lieutenant. The question you're actually asking is whether she's made peace with it." Kessler held that for a moment. "Has she?" "I think she's been making peace with it for a very long time," Harlan said. "Long before yesterday gave her a reason to." Kessler nodded slowly. Something settled in his expression, not resolution, but the specific adjustment of a person who has been worrying about something in one direction and has just been redirected to the more accurate version of the same worry. He would still worry, but now he would worry about the right thing. "Sir." His voice was quieter now. "I dismissed her too. On the convoy. Not like Delgado, I didn't receive a specific report from her and dismiss it. But I spent 6 hours in the same vehicle, and I didn't look." He stopped. Started again. "I've been going over it since yesterday. The manifest, the supply inventory discussions, the way she positioned herself in the vehicle, everything that was right there and I processed as background." "Yes," Harlan said simply. "That's all yes. You already understand what you did, Lieutenant. You've been understanding it for the past 24 hours. There's nothing I can add to that understanding that would make it more useful to you." He stood. "What I can tell you is that the conversation going forward is not about what you missed. It's about what you're going to do with what you know now." He left before Kessler could find an answer to that because the answer was not something Harlan could provide. It was the kind of answer a person has to build themselves in the specific time and space that follows, understanding something painful about who they were. 0600 the next morning, 48 hours after the ambush. Maya was on the east perimeter of the forward base when Briggs found her, which was where she had taken to going in the early hours, not because it was assigned or required, but because the east perimeter had a clear line of sight across the route the convoy had used to arrive, and standing there with the M24 was the closest thing to processing she had found. Briggs handed her the folded note without explaining it. She opened it, read it again. "Delgado," she said. "Yes." She refolded it carefully, held it. "Did the general ask you to give this to me?" "He asked me to make sure you saw it." She nodded once. She put the note in her jacket pocket, the inner one, the one closest to her chest. Briggs watched her do it and understood what the gesture meant without needing it explained. "Route assessments done," she said. "Hale and I finished the analysis last night. I was going to bring it to you at 0700. Bring it now. We've got a situation." She turned and looked at him fully. His face told her the situation was not small. "Intel update came in at 0400, Briggs said. "The man the village elder described Pollock's team got a partial identification. He's not a local operator. He's been running coordinated ambush networks across 3 provinces for the past 8 months. The previous 3 convoys that were hit, they're his work." "The demonstration," she said. Briggs looked at her sharply. "Who told you about that?" "Nobody. It's the only logic that makes sense. You don't coordinate 4 ambushes against logistics convoys if your goal is attrition. The supply impact is too small. You do it if your goal is to demonstrate that you have access to protected route intelligence, that you can reach inside the planning process. She paused. You do it to create fear at the command level, to make commanders second-guess their own logistics chains. Briggs stared at her for 3 seconds. Pollock said almost exactly those words in the briefing. Pollock's good. Pollock is excellent. And she also said something else. He paused. The next convoy is not a standard logistics run. It's carrying something that specific people with specific access to planning documents know about. And if the same network that hit us 2 days ago has access to the same level of planning information, then the next convoy is already compromised, Maya said. Possibly? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The early morning air was still cool, and she stood in it with the M24 at her side and thought through the implications at the speed. She always thought not fast in the reckless sense, but fast in the way of someone who has been holding the relevant information organized in her mind and can retrieve it immediately when the next piece arrives. What's being done about the leak? She asked. Pollock's running a compartmentalization protocol. The convoy route and timing are being restricted to a need-to-know list of 7 people. The information given to the broader logistics coordination is being managed real enough to allow operational preparation modified enough that if it surfaces in enemy planning, we'll know exactly where it came from. A controlled disclosure. Yes. And if the ambush comes anyway based on what they already know before the new protocol takes effect, then we need the convoy's overwatch to be something they're not expecting, Briggs said. He let that land. He watched it land. Maya looked at him with the expression of someone who has just been told the full dimension of what they signed up for and is taking a moment to make sure the measure is accurate. How many days? She asked. 2. She nodded. I'll need to walk the route. The section between the agricultural station and the ridgeline, Hale and I flagged 3 potential overwatch positions for an attacking force, but I want to physically assess the angles before I commit to a counter position. I'll arrange it. You'll go with Morrison. Morrison's arm has opinions about its own limitations that differ from the medical officers. He'll be navigational support. You do the assessment. He paused. And Carter, the general wants a briefing at 1000. Full route analysis, overwatch, positioning, your recommendations for convoy force protection adjustments. You're presenting. She looked at him. I'm presenting. You did the analysis. You present the analysis. She absorbed that. In the Army's usual grammar, a corporal did not present force protection analysis to a major general in a command briefing. The corporal's work was routed through the appropriate chain, attributed in footnotes, if attributed at all, and presented by someone with the rank to stand in the room credibly. Harlan was changing the grammar. 0-1000, she said. 0-1000, he confirmed. He turned to go, then stopped. One more thing. Reeves submitted the revised force protection protocol this morning. The mandatory reporting channel for convoy observations, it's going into effect immediately across the battalion. He looked back at her. He cited yesterday's engagement specifically, by name. She said nothing for a moment. By name. Your name. In the protocol document. In the citation for why the protocol is necessary. His voice was level but not neutral. There was something underneath it that was closest to the specific satisfaction of watching a correction happen that should have happened earlier. He didn't have to do that. He chose to. She looked back at the route, at the road that had brought them here. Okay, she said quietly. Briggs left her alone with the morning. The briefing at 1000 lasted 47 minutes and covered 3 times the ground that briefings of that type usually covered. Because Maya had not prepared a summary, she had prepared a complete analysis, and she delivered it the way her father had taught her to deliver information, starting with what was certain, moving to what was probable, being explicit about what was unknown and why it was unknown, and ending with specific recommendations that could be acted on rather than general observations that could be filed. Harlan listened without interrupting. Pollock asked 4 questions, each one sharp and specific. Webb asked 2. Hale, who was present because Maya had specifically requested that he be included, given his contribution to the route assessment, said nothing during the briefing itself, but sat with the focused attention of a man who is learning something he intends to keep. When she finished, there was a silence of the particular kind that follows a presentation that has said everything it needed to say. Pollock looked at Harlan. The ridgeline assessment changes the counter positioning significantly. If she's right about the sight lines, she walked it with Morrison this morning, Harlan said. She's right. Pollock accepted that. Then the convoy's secondary element needs to shift north by 200 meters from the current plan. Agreed. Harlan looked at Webb. Adjust the convoy configuration. I want the overwatch position confirmed and prepped no later than 1800 tomorrow. Sir. Webb was already writing. Harlan looked at Maya. Good work, Corporal. It was not delivered as a compliment in the ordinary sense. It was delivered as a statement of fact, which was exactly how she received it. Sir, she said, I have one more recommendation. He waited. The control disclosure protocol, the modified route information being circulated to identify the leak source. If the network activates on that information, the ambush will be positioned based on the false route. But experienced operators will run reconnaissance before committing. If they run reconnaissance and find the convoy isn't where the information said it would be, they'll know the disclosure was controlled. She paused. The convoy needs to follow the false route long enough to be credible, long enough that reconnaissance confirms the convoy's approach. And then it needs to deviate at a point where the deviation is covered by terrain and not observable from the positions they're likely to use. The room was completely still. Pollock looked at her with an expression that was unambiguous. It was the expression of a professional who has just heard their own thinking articulated by someone who shouldn't, by institutional logic, be in the room. That's a significant operational risk to the convoy. Yes, ma'am, but the alternative is that we run the same protocol and they don't take the bait because they know we know, and we're no closer to identifying the leak or dismantling the network. She held Pollock's gaze. The risk is real. The intelligence value is also real. I'm not saying it's a simple decision. I'm saying it needs to be on the table. Pollock looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at the map on the table and said nothing for 10 seconds. Then, it goes on the table. We worked through the risk architecture this afternoon. He stood. Dismissed. Carter, stay. The room emptied. Briggs was last out and he pulled the door behind him with the careful precision of a man who understands when a room needs its boundaries respected. Harlan remained standing. Maya remained standing. The map was between them. You're not afraid to say the difficult thing, he said. No, sir. That's going to serve you well in this role. It's also going to create friction. I know. People with rank who are wrong don't enjoy being shown they're wrong by people with less rank who are right. That dynamic doesn't disappear because I've put you in an overwatch position. It becomes more frequent. Sir, she said carefully, that dynamic already existed when I was in rear support. I just wasn't in a room where the people who could change it were listening. He looked at her for a long moment. Then for the first time since the convoy halt 2 days ago, something in his expression moved that was not purely professional, a brief real acknowledgement of the specific truth she had just spoken. Fair, he said. She almost smiled. Almost. The route walk this morning, he said. Morrison's assessment of you. I wasn't aware Sergeant Morrison assessed me, sir. Morrison assesses everything. He told Briggs you moved through the ridgeline terrain like someone who had done it before. He said, and again I'm quoting directly because the words are specific, that you weren't learning the ground. You were confirming it. She was quiet for a moment. I've studied topographic maps of this region for the past 6 months, since before the deployment. Since before the deployment, he repeated. I requested the assignment to this theater. I spent the 3 months before we shipped studying every route map and elevation profile I could access through the logistics coordination systems. She paused. I was in rear support, sir. I had time. He absorbed the full picture of that, a soldier who had been systematically underestimated and underutilized, and who had spent the time that her underutilization created, preparing in meticulous and self-directed solitude for a role she had not been given and had not stopped trying to be ready for. You were preparing, he said. I was waiting, she said, and preparing seemed like the better use of the time. He picked up the pen from the table and held it without using it for a moment, a thinking gesture, one of his tells. The inquiry record goes to battalion tomorrow. The personnel file amendment follows it. What you need to know is that this is going to generate conversation at levels above mine. I understand. There are people at those levels who will interpret what happened here as an anomaly, as an outlier. They will look for ways to categorize it that don't require them to examine the systems that put you in rear support in the first place. I know that too, sir. Are you prepared for that conversation? Because it will come, and it will come in rooms where I'm not present. She looked at him steadily. Sir, I've been having that conversation for 3 years. The rooms just usually don't have anyone listening. He nodded. Set the pen down. Go get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be long. She moved toward the door. Her hand was on the edge of the frame when he spoke again. Carter. She stopped, turned. The note from Delgado. She waited. He came to me this morning before 0600, asked if he could request reassignment to the convoy's secondary element. He said he wanted to be on the route this time, not behind it. She looked at him with an expression that was careful and genuine at once. What did you tell him? I told him I'd consider it. He paused. What would you tell him? She thought about it for a real moment, not performing consideration, actually doing it, actually weighing the 19-year-old who had dismissed her report against the 19-year-old who had written 3 lines in careful block letters, and then come to a general before dawn and asked to stand in the place where the cost might be real. I'd tell him yes, she said, even after what it cost. Especially because of what it cost, she said. He knows what it costs now. People who know that and still ask to stand in it, that's what you want on a convoy. Harlan held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. She walked out into the midday heat of the forward base and stood for a moment with the M24 at her side, and the sun on her face and the weight of the day, and the day before, and the 2 years before that, and the whole long arc of preparation and dismissal and waiting behind her. Morrison found her there 20 seconds later because Morrison had the specific talent of finding people the moment they had a second to breathe. Briefing went well, he said. It wasn't a question. It went. Hale hasn't stopped talking about the ridgeline analysis. He paused, his unwounded arm crossed over the sling. He's a good shooter, Hale. Not your level, but good. He's also smart enough to know he's not your level, which makes him smarter than most. He asks good questions. He listens to the answers, which is rarer. Morrison turned and looked out in the same direction she was looking. The road, the route, the terrain they were about to move through again with the weight of everything they now knew. You ready for the day after tomorrow? She thought about that. The real version of the question. Not logistically ready, not tactically ready. Those were settled. The other kind of ready. The kind that isn't really about preparation at all, but about what a person carries into a situation and whether the weight of it is something they can move through rather than something that stops them. Yes, she said. Morrison looked at her sideways. No hesitation. The hesitation happened 2 days ago. I worked through it. She glanced at him. Your arm. My arm is fine. Your arm has a hole in it. My arm has had worse. He turned toward the operations tent. Come on, Pollock wants to work through the route deviation protocol, and she asked for both of us. Maya fell into step beside him, not behind, not ahead beside, and they walked through the forward base together with the easy purpose of 2 people who have enough to do and know exactly what it is. Above them, the sun was at its peak and the day was fully open, and somewhere in the intelligence files that Pollock was organizing the name of the man who had coordinated 4 ambushes and killed 4 soldiers and nearly killed 43 more was getting closer to something that looked like accountability. And on the route that the next convoy would take in 2 days in the ridgeline terrain that Maya had walked that morning and confirmed rather than learned her overwatch position was waiting. Not temporary, not improvised, not unauthorized. Hers. The night before the convoy moved, nobody slept well. That was not unusual before an operation with this many variables and this much deliberate uncertainty built into it. The controlled disclosure protocol meant that the convoy would be moving on a route that had been fed to the suspected leak, which meant that if the leak was real and the network was active, there were people on the other end of that information who were already positioning, already waiting, already building the same kind of pre-planned geometry that had swallowed the first convoy and nearly not let it go. The difference this time was that the convoy knew it was being watched, and Maya Carter was going to be watching back. She lay on her cot at 0100 and stared at the ceiling of the supply tent and ran the route in her mind the way her father had taught her to run a course before you walk it. Not imagining it, not visualizing it in the soft, aspirational way people mean when they use that word, but thinking it. Every elevation change, every angle, every window of exposure from the ridgeline position that she had selected, and every window of vulnerability in that position itself, and every contingency that branched off those vulnerabilities, and what each contingency required of her. She had done this the night before the first convoy too, before the ambush, before everything. The difference was that this time she knew exactly what she was preparing for. She sat up at 01:30, accepted that sleep was not a realistic outcome, and reached for the M24. Not to check it, she had checked it 3 times before lying down. She held it the way she sometimes held it when she needed to think clearly, the weight of it familiar, in a way that went past muscle memory into something that didn't have a precise name. Her father had understood that. He had never explained it, which meant he had understood it completely. She thought about him for a while, not with grief or not only with grief, with the specific gratitude of someone who understands in full detail what they were given and why it mattered and what it cost to give it. He had known. She was certain of that now. He had known what he was building, and he had built it anyway every weekend for 11 years, patient and precise and demanding, in the way that real love is demanding, not asking for less than what she could do, always asking for exactly what she could do, which was always more than what she had done before. She had never once heard him express doubt about what she was capable of. She had spent 3 years in the Army expressing it for him. 0400. She got up dressed and went to find Briggs. He was already awake, which she had expected, sitting outside the operations tent with a cup of coffee he was not drinking and a map he was not reading. He looked up when he heard her and said nothing, which was its own form of communication. She sat down across from him. Talk me through the timeline. He talked her through it. Convoy moves at 0600. Secondary element, the decoy configuration, takes the disclosed route. Primary convoy deviates at the agricultural station junction 7 kilometers in. The deviation puts them onto the northern bypass, which the false route information had not included. If the network has taken the bait and positioned for the disclosed route, they will be waiting in the wrong place. If the network has not taken the bait, or if they've confirmed the discrepancy through reconnaissance, the ambush could come anywhere. Pollux read on the probability, Maya asked, 70-30, 70 that they've taken the bait, 30 that they've identified the deviation. 30 is high. Yes, Briggs said, it is. And if it's the 30 bow, then the convoy is running a live operation against an enemy that knows the terrain, has demonstrated network coordination, and has already shown they can plan to a surgical level. He finally looked up from the map, which is why you're going to be on that ridge at 0530, before the convoy moves, before anyone who might be running reconnaissance has confirmed their positions. She nodded. And Hale, secondary overwatch position, eastern approach. He'll have radio contact with you and with convoy command. Morrison with convoy element. He refused the non-combat assignment again, and Harlan let him refuse it. Briggs paused. The general said, and these are his exact words, that a man who comes back from a graze wound in less than 48 hours is either stupid or necessary, and Morrison isn't stupid. She almost smiled again. This time it got a little further than the last time. Get some food, Briggs said. 0500, you and Hale moved to position. She stood, stopped. Briggs? Yeah. If this goes wrong, we handle it the same way we handled the last time it went wrong, he said, which is to say we do what needs doing with whatever we have available. He looked at her with the directness of a man who has decided that honesty is the only appropriate register for this particular conversation. But this time we have you in the right position, and that changes the math. She held his gaze for a moment, then she went to get food. 0500. Maya and Hale moved out of the forward base in the pre-dawn dark with the specific economy of movement that people develop when they've thought through every physical decision in advance. No wasted steps, no adjustment. The gear was positioned correctly the first time because she had positioned it correctly the night before, because preparation was the only form of control available to her, and she had long ago learned to take it seriously. Hale was quiet beside her. He had been different since the route assessment. Not deferential, which would have been wrong, but attentive in a way that was genuine rather than performed. He had watched her work and understood what he was watching and responded to it with the specific respect that competence offers. Competence. She valued that more than she would have been able to explain to him if he'd asked. He didn't ask. He just kept pace. They reached the ridgeline position at 0528, 2 minutes ahead of schedule, which was intentional. She needed 2 minutes. She settled into the position, the specific hollow of earth and rock she had identified on her morning walk with Morrison, the angle that gave her the critical sightlines without exposing her position to the most likely reconnaissance routes. She ran through the geometry one more time, physically confirming what she had confirmed in her mind 100 times already. It held. She keyed the radio. Overwatch 1 in position, eyes on primary corridor. Harlan's voice came back immediately, which told her he had been on the radio since before 0500. Copy Overwatch 1, convoy moves in 30. Copy, Hale's voice from the eastern position, Overwatch 2 in position. Copy 2, Harlan said. Radio discipline from this point, necessary traffic only. Silence settled over the radio. Maya lay in her position with the M24 up, and her breathing controlled, and her eyes working the terrain ahead in the systematic pattern her father had taught her, near to far left to right, not searching for something specific, but keeping the whole picture in motion so that nothing could settle into invisibility. The convoy moved at 0600 exactly on time. She heard it before she could track it, the engine sound reaching the ridge before the vehicles came into sight. She identified the lead vehicle, counted the column, confirmed the configuration. Everything as briefed. The first 7 kilometers were clean. She tracked the convoy's movement with part of her attention and kept the rest distributed across the terrain, the ridgelines to the north. The cluster of trees along the western edge of the agricultural station approached the elevated water structure that Hale had flagged during the route assessment as a potential positioning point. The agricultural station junction came at 0641. The convoy deviated. It was smooth. The lead vehicle took the northern bypass without hesitation, without telegraphing, without the kind of behavioral tell that trained observers look for. The convoy simply stopped being on the disclosed route and began being on the real one. And from the outside, if you didn't know, the junction was the decision point. It looked like a standard navigation adjustment. Maya exhaled slowly. Deviation confirmed, she said quietly into the radio. Copy, Harlan said. The next 20 minutes were the most concentrated silence she had ever experienced. The convoy moved north along the bypass. She tracked it and tracked the terrain simultaneously, keeping the full picture alive, not letting any corner of her field of observation go static. At 0703, she saw movement, not on the convoy's route. North and east on the ridgeline that flanked the original disclosed route, the route the convoy was no longer on. A shape that resolved as she held her focus on it into a man with binoculars. Then another lower in a position consistent with a prepared firing point. They were in the wrong place. The controlled disclosure had worked. They had positioned for the false route, and the convoy had not been there, and now they were watching a road that had nothing on it and trying to understand why. Overwatch 1, I have 2 possible targets. Northern ridgeline, eastern section. They are not on the convoy route. Repeat, not on the convoy route. They're watching the decoy corridor. A pause, then Harlan. Copy Overwatch 1, hold observation. Do not engage unless they move toward the convoy. Copy, she held. The 2 figures on the northern ridge stayed where they were for 6 minutes. She could read their body language, even at that distance. Confusion communication, the specific agitation of people who have committed to a position based on information that has just proven wrong. One of them was on the radio, reporting back to someone, reporting that the convoy wasn't there. At 0711, they began to move, not toward the convoy's actual route, away from it. Withdrawing, the network was pulling back. Movement, she said into the radio. Both targets withdrawing, northern direction. Copy, Harlan said. Hold. She held. She tracked the withdrawal until both figures were out of her sight line, and she could confirm the direction of movement had not reversed. Target's clear, she said. Convoy corridor appears clean. The convoy reached its destination at 0817. 11 minutes ahead of the planned timeline, because the bypass route, free of any engagement, had allowed the column to move at full speed without the caution that a compromised route requires. Harlan's voice on the radio had a quality she had not heard in it before when he confirmed arrival. It was not relief. He was not a man who expressed relief. It was the specific quality of a person for whom something they have worked hard to make possible has just been made real. Overwatch 1 convoy secure. Good work. Come in. She lay in the ridgeline position for 30 more seconds after the radio transmission ended. Not because she needed to, the operation was over, the convoy was secure, the threat had retreated. She lay there because she wanted to feel the specific texture of this moment before it became memory. She had been in the right position. She had seen what needed to be seen. She had held when holding was right and reported when reporting was right. Nobody had died today. That was the whole thing. That was the entire weight of it, and it was not small. She got up, secured the M24, and began the movement back. Hale met her at the base of the ridge. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has just come through something and is still deciding how large it was. They were on the wrong ridge, he said. Yes. The disclosure worked. The disclosure worked. She kept moving. But they had people in position. They were ready. If the convoy had been on that route, it wasn't, Hale said. It wasn't, she agreed. This time. He understood what she meant. One operation, one success. The network was still out there. The man who had organized 4 ambushes and coordinated the delivery of route intelligence to an attacking force was still operating. Today had been a victory of denial. The convoy had arrived safely. The ambush had found nothing. The network had pulled back. It was real and it mattered. It was not finished. They walked back to the forward base without speaking, and the silence between them was the good kind. The kind that holds understanding rather than avoiding it. The debrief happened at 0900, and it was the most efficient debrief Harlan had ever run, which was itself a statement about how clear the picture was. Pollock presented the intelligence outcome. The network had confirmed the disclosed route to their positioning element. The positioning element had deployed to the wrong location, and in doing so, had generated a confirmation of the leak source that the intelligence team had needed. The information that reached them came from a single node in the logistics coordination chain, Pollock said. She placed a folder on the table. Administrative access. A civilian contractor attached to the battalion's supply coordination office. He's been flagged. MPs are being briefed. The room took that in. One person, one access point, one contractor who had, whether through ideology, coercion, or something as ordinary and devastating as money, been feeding route intelligence to a network that had used it to kill soldiers. Harlan looked at the folder without opening it. How long? Based on the 4 previous ambushes, at least 8 months, possibly longer. 8 months. Harlan's jaw tightened once and then released. And today? Today they have nothing. The convoy arrived, no casualties. And the network now knows their intelligence source has been identified, which means the source is burned whether they've moved on him yet or not. Pollock looked up. It doesn't end the network, but it severs their access to our planning information. They go blind. And the man running the network. We have a better profile now than we've ever had. The withdrawal today, the route they used, the timing, the direction our signals people were watching. It narrows the search significantly. She paused. It won't be today, but it's moving. Harlan nodded. He looked around the table. Morrison with his arms still in a sling and his expression unchanged from his baseline of controlled determination. Webb with the particular satisfaction of a man whose logistical contributions to the operation had functioned as designed. Briggs, who had been awake for most of 36 hours and showed it only around his eyes. And Maya Carter, who was sitting in a chair at this table that she had not been permitted to sit in 6 days ago. Corporal Carter, Harlan said. Sir, your assessment of today's operation, 1 sentence. She thought for exactly 2 seconds. The network is disciplined enough to withdraw cleanly when compromised, which means the next engagement will not benefit from the element of surprise we had today. The room went very quiet. Pollock nodded once, the small, precise nod of someone who has reached the same conclusion and is confirming that. Harlan looked at Maya with the expression that had become its own kind of language between them. The expression that said he had heard what she said and understood both what was in it and what it cost her to say it. Because saying it was not pessimism. Saying it was the specific discipline of a person who refuses to let a success become a blindfold. Noted, he said. We'll build from that. The formal debrief ended at 0958. The room cleared in the organized flow that follows the conclusion of a tight operation, people who have things to act on, moving to act on them. Pollock to the intelligence team. Webb to logistics. Morrison against all reasonable expectation to the range, because Morrison processed tension the way some people process it in motion, and the range was as close to motion as his arm would allow. Briggs stayed until the last person left and then looked at Harlan. Sir, the battalion commander wants a call at 1300. He's been briefed on the outline of the past 4 days, and he has questions. I expect he does. He specifically mentioned Corporal Carter's reassignment. Harlan looked at him steadily. I expect he did. Is there anything you want me to prepare for that call? The full record, the inquiry documentation, the personnel file, the operational outcomes of both convoy operations. He paused. And Carter's Overwatch log from today. Every observation, every report, every decision. Time-stamped. Yes, sir. Briggs moved toward the door. Briggs? Sir. When the battalion commander has reviewed the full record, he's going to have a choice. He can accept the operational outcome as sufficient justification and let the reassignment stand. Or he can try to route it through the standard reassignment review process, which will take 6 to 10 weeks and require Carter to return to rear support status during that period. He paused. If he chooses the second option, I will tell him that the operational record documents a direct correlation between Carter's forward deployment and mission success, and that returning her to rear support during an active intelligence operation against an active ambush network constitutes an unnecessary elevation of risk to convoy personnel. Briggs was quiet for a moment. And if he disagrees with that assessment, then he disagrees, Harlan said simply, and we have that conversation at whatever level it needs to happen. Briggs looked at him for a long second. Then he nodded once with the same weight the nod had carried in that first conversation at the convoy when Harlan had told him nobody touches that rifle. Some things once set in motion by the right person have a gravity of their own. Maya was at the east perimeter when Briggs found her, which by this point had become a pattern that neither of them felt the need to remark on. She was standing with the M24 at her side and her eyes on the road, and she looked from behind exactly like a person who has found the place they belong and has decided to stand in it. He stood beside her. Battalion commander wants a call at 1300. Harlan's taking it. About the reassignment. Among other things. She nodded. She already knew what that meant. The institutional machinery that she had been running against for 3 years was not going to stop running because 4 days had changed what one general understood. Systems are slow. Systems protect their own consistency. Systems do not enjoy being shown their errors by the people the errors were made about. I've been thinking, she said. Yeah, about the network, the man running it. She turned to look at Briggs. He's going to know that today failed. He's going to know his intelligence source is burned, and he's going to adapt. She paused. The next time he moves, it won't be against a logistics convoy. The supply route intelligence was a means to an end. The end was demonstrating access, creating fear at the command level, destabilizing logistics. Confidence. He's lost that tool. She looked back at the route. So what does he use next? Briggs stared at her. You've been thinking about this since the debrief ended. I've been thinking about it since the debrief started. Have you talked to Pollock? Not yet. Go talk to Pollock. She turned toward the intelligence tent, stopped, looked back at him one more time. Briggs, the 4 we lost. He waited. I'm going to remember their names every time I'm in position. Ortega. What was Simmons? Briggs said quietly. Torres, Park. She held those names for a moment, said them again inwardly in the place where she was already building the structure that would carry them. Simmons, Torres, Park. Yes, Briggs said, I'm going to remember. I know, he said. That's why you're the right person for this. She walked toward the intelligence tent with the M24 at her side, and the sun overhead, and the weight of 4 names, and the weight of 7 engagements, and the weight of 11 years, and the weight of a father who had believed in her with the kind of certainty that outlasts the person who holds it, and she carried all of it without bowing because that was what she had been built to do. At 1300, Harlan took the call from the battalion commander. It lasted 41 minutes. The details of the conversation stayed in the room where the conversation happened, as such conversations do. What emerged from it was not. Briggs found out from Webb, who had been in the outer section of the command tent on logistics coordination and had heard the call's conclusion without trying to. He found Maya at 1700 in the intelligence tent with Pollock and 2 analysts building a threat projection model for the network's next likely operation. He stood in the door for a moment. Pollock saw him and read his face and said calmly, Carter, take 5. Maya looked up. She saw Briggs. She came to the door. He told her in the hallway quietly and directly because that was the only way to tell her something like this. The battalion commander had reviewed the full record. He had spent 41 minutes asking Harlan every question the record raised, and several it didn't. And at the end of those 41 minutes, he had said four things. First, the reassignment stood. Second, the force protection protocol revision that Reeves had submitted, citing Maya's name, was being elevated to a brigade-level standing order. Third, Maya Carter's personnel file was being formally amended to reflect a marksmanship classification that should have been assigned at her first qualification cycle 3 years ago. Fourth, the battalion commander wanted her assigned to the specialized counter-ambush working group that Pollock was being asked to lead, a group that would be working directly on dismantling the network that had run 4 ambushes and nearly run a 5th. Maya stood in the hallway and listened to all 4 things without interrupting. When Briggs finished, she was quiet for a moment that was exactly long enough to be real. "The working group," she said. "Pollock asked for you specifically. Apparently your threat projection analysis this afternoon was," he paused, choosing the word persuasive, Chimots. Something moved through her face. Not surprise, not even relief exactly. The specific feeling of things arriving in the right order, at the right time, not a miracle, not luck, but the outcome of a long and serious investment in being ready, when ready was what the moment required. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. "That's it." She looked at him. "What else should it be?" He shook his head slowly. "Most people in this situation. I've been doing the work for 3 years, Briggs. The recognition is not the work. The work is still the work." She looked back toward the intelligence tent. "And right now, the work is figuring out what this network does next before they do it." She went back in. Briggs stood in the hallway for a moment by himself and thought about the first time he had seen her sitting on an ammunition crate with a notebook, writing quickly the M24 beside her, unassigned and unrecognized and completely devastatingly ready. He thought about everything that had happened in 4 days. He thought about 4 names: Simmons, Torres, Park, Ortega, and the specific cost of 4 days that had started before the right person was in the right position. He thought about the next convoy, the one after that, the one after that. Every route through every piece of terrain in this theater that now had a different calculation attached to it because of one decision made in a village that no longer felt staged, that felt only like the place where something important had been revealed. He straightened up, walked toward the operations tent. The forward base continued around him in its uninterrupted operational rhythm, generators and voices, in the business of people who have things to do and understand why doing them matters. In the intelligence tent, Maya Carter was building a threat model for an enemy who did not yet know she was looking for him. She was not in the back of the convoy anymore. She was not behind it or beside it or waiting to be told where she fit. When the next convoy rolled out, she would be in front of it on the high ground with the M24 across her arms and the names of 4 soldiers in the part of her chest that does not forget, and the absolute unambiguous certainty of a person who has found through fire and cost and the long patience of someone who never stopped preparing exactly where she was always meant to stand. And this time, not one person in that convoy would think to ask who gave her the rifle, because the rifle and the ground beneath her and the mission ahead of her were already undeniably and permanently hers.